I have started the PowerShell as an administrator. What I'm going to do now is to type Docker images. You can find that I have this image that I created in my previous sessions, my batch app latest. And we know inside this image we have an exe application called my super busy app that uses a lot of CPU when you run it. So if you type docker run, let's say I'm going to run it interactively, the image that I'm going to run is my batch app latest image. And inside that, I know there's an application called my super busy app, which I'm going to run now. When I run this application, it's going to spin up multiple threads and then going to keep the CPU busy. And if you look at the resource utilization under task manager, you will see that it's using 100% of the CPU, a classic bad behaving application. So if this container uses 100% of the CPU, other containers may not have enough CPU to use. So how can we control the CPUs allocated for this program? So let me start PowerShell and then stop this my super busy app container that is running. So docker ps, so this is a run container, type docker stop and the container ID to stop that container. So the container is stopped. Let's clean up the screen to understand how we can control the resources allocated for this container. What you can use is something called control groups. So you can type, for example, docker run, let's say we are going to run interactively, and then type --CPU% and allocate only a fraction of the CPU, in this case 20% of the CPU. And I'm going to run my batch app latest image and then going to run my super busy app inside this container. So instead of allocating 100% of the CPU, in this case I'm allocating only the fraction of the CPU. You can find that the application is running slowly, and if you look at the resource utilization, you can find that it's not using the 100% of the CPU this time. So in this way, you can allocate just enough resources for the containers you want. Let me start PowerShell again and then type docker ps and then type to docker stop container ID to stop this running container. Let's clear the screen and then find what other commands, options that are available for me to control resources. So if you type docker run --help, you can find some other options you can give to control the resources. What we just use is this option called CPU%, but there are other options available for you to control different resources. Windows do not support all the control groups that Linux machine may support, but it supports things like the memory, the CPU%, and the command may differ from the commands that you may find online for Linux environments. The best way to understand what resource groups that you can control, you can refer to Microsoft documentations, where it specifically highlights what resources that you can control in Windows environments. For example, a memory is something that you can control. And also the CPU% that we use. So there are different resources you can control. It depends on the operating system support. For example, the CPU% is implemented through this interface called processor maximum. So let's try to use this, try to control memory allocated to a container. To do that, what I'm going to type is docker run, let's say interactively. I'm going to allocate, let's say, CPU% of 20%, and then I'm going to allocate a memory of, let's say, 50 megabyte. And then, of course, I can specify the image I want to run. In this case, my batch app latest image, and inside that, I know I have an application called my super busy app.exe. So if you type enter, it will start with 20% of CPU and about 50 megabyte of RAM. Application is running, but it's slow. So let me go into Docker PS and then stop this container that I started. So I'm in my PowerShell again. What I'm going to teach you here is some issues you may run into when you try to control resources in Windows environment. For example, if you run a container, in this case I'm going to run it interactively and allocate a certain CPU percent, or let's say I'm going to allocate certain memory limit. Let's say I'm going to allocate 10 megabyte of memory and then try to run my batch app latest image. And we know inside that we have an application called my under my app folder, my batch app. So I'm going to run this application with a very small amount of memory. Obviously, it will not have enough memory, so it's going to take a lot of time to start, or very likely it will crash. Sometimes you may find that this will get stuck like this for a long time and it will not give any response. And if you try to start PowerShell as an administrator and then type a Docker command like say Docker PS to view the running containers, that command also will get stuck. So how can you, if you run into this kind of situation when you execute the labs, how can you stop it? One way is to, of course, to restart the machine. But the other dirty trick is to go there and then stop the Docker service that is running. This is not the recommended approach. Do not do this one in production. But in this lab session, you can, of course, do that. And I will also showcase you what other issues you may run if you do this kind of stopping of Docker service abruptly instead of letting Docker to handle these resource controls and management of the Docker containers. So I stop the container and then start the Docker service again. So if you type Docker PS, of course, now it will start working again. So let me start PowerShell again as an administrator. Let's clean up the screen. And if I run Docker, and in this case, instead of giving 10 megabyte of memory, I'm going to give 50 megabyte of memory. Going to run my batch app latest image. So it's slightly more than 10 megabyte, but still not enough for this batch app, which is written in a .NET application, to run. So if you allocate this amount of memory and then type enter, depending on how your application ran, you may get an out of memory exception. So this exception you got from the application. So it's the .NET application, the My SuperBC app, crashing, saying that it doesn't have enough memory to start. The Docker PS still works. There's no issue for the container host. But the application that I just ran crashed because you didn't allocate enough memory for it to run. So instead of running with 50 megabyte of memory, let's run it with 100 megabyte of memory. So I'm going to start my batch app with 100 megabyte of memory. And in this case, it will have enough memory to start the application, do all the background .NET work. So in this case, the application started. Go back to PowerShell, type a Docker PS, get the container ID, and type Docker stop to stop that running container. Container is stopped. Type CLS. If you type Docker PS -a, let's do some cleanup of this environment. When I type Docker remove and then try to do a batch remove of this one, sometimes you may get an error saying that it cannot clean up this environment. So you can find that some containers are exited, but it gave you an error saying that Windows filter failed to remove root file system, some error, the process cannot access the file because another process is using that. If you type docker psa, you can find that some containers ID here are marked as dead. So if you try to remove these, you will not be able to remove them. So the only way to do that is to restart your lab machine. So these containers will be removed once you restart. So if you try to, for example, type docker remove force and then give the container ID, to still give the error saying that some other processes are referring these files. So what I did was I restarted the machine, and the Docker took care of removing the dead containers that I had before. Do not try to fiddle around with the Docker file system. You are not supposed to manually interfere and then manage the Docker file system. Let the Docker handle it. Worst case, you can restart the machine to get it working into the previous state. So if you type docker psa, now you don't find any changed or dead containers. So don't just go into Docker like before and then try to start or stop this Docker instance. Make sure that you let Docker handle itself. You are not supposed to go there and then start and stop Docker service as and when you wish, especially in the production environments. So if you type docker images, you have my batch application, and if you type docker ps-a, the commands are working fine and there's no any dead containers.